Greetings all, I am Seminary Scholar, and this is my channel where I discuss the beliefs of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. To preface, I have attended the Church's Seminary and Institute programs, and I am going to be referring to official sources. I, however, am not an official representative of the Church. I'm just trying to make what I know more understandable and more accessible for the general public. If you want to look further into the Church, once again, I have links in the description on the subject I will be discussing, or you can poke around their website for yourself at churchofjesuschrist.org. Today I'm going to be doing something a little different because I was taking a look at my video from last week, Acquiring Spiritual Knowledge, link in the corner, but I was taking a look at it and I realized it didn't quite fit in the perspective essays category, because perspective essays are more about what we believe and what we study. And I realized more and more as I thought about it that acquiring spiritual knowledge isn't so much what we study as it is how we study. And so I've decided to create a new series on this channel called Navigation Tools that's going to talk about how we study as opposed to what we study. And this is going to be another installment in that series. And I'm going to be talking about a principle we use in our study called Likening the Scriptures. And I'm going to kind of run through the process with you, give you a little bit of introduction, and then kind of run you through different ways to show you how likening the Scriptures is different to perhaps conventional Scripture study. So yes, to get started, I want to start with the purpose of likening the Scriptures, and that purpose is that understanding the Scriptures is difficult because first of all, it was translated in a different version of English than most of us are familiar with, because the Bible was translated into, I believe it was Elizabethan English, and depending on the interpretation you use, of course, we use the King James Version, which is an older dialect. But another major stumbling block is the context, because it is very difficult to sympathize with characters from such a distant point in time with very different cultural views and who are in very different circumstances. And this is what likening the Scriptures tries to get at. And we'll see a little bit later how that works. But first I wanted to try and run through a bit more of a conventional model, I think, of how studying the Scriptures is done. This is certainly how I started out before I understood the concept of likening the Scriptures. And I'm calling this gleaning from the Scriptures because it seems like an appropriate term. But in this version of learning from the Scriptures, essentially what you do is you look at the story by itself, and you try and figure out what the story is about, or what the story was meant to be about when it was written. So, for example, the story of David and Goliath is a story about a boy who has faith and he does something, and it's spectacular. And there are a couple of problems with this way of studying. First, it's harder to remember. Yes, you've connected a principle to the story, but since a lot of the principles you're going to be drawing on are very similar, especially because many stories in the Gospel do have similar threads running through them. And so the Scriptures tend to kind of blend together when you do this. So the story of David and Goliath is about faith. The story of Daniel is about faith. Because ultimately all of these stories are about faith, but they're also about other things. And as you add more and more interpretations of the story, it's just hard to keep them straight, and you're more likely to forget. And so with all these blending together, and another problem with this that is not a problem with likening the Scriptures is that it doesn't resonate. You have learned a factoid about a story about someone who lived thousands of years ago that doesn't really click with you because they were facing different problems, they were doing different things. Likening the Scriptures takes this and flips it on its head. Because when we liken the Scriptures, what we do is we take those stories out of the vacuum and we make them relevant to us. And I'm not sure what the official process is with this. I know that the general concept of likening the Scriptures is to apply the Scriptures into our lives. That is, likening the Scriptures in a sentence. Just apply the Scriptures to your lives. And I want to kind of walk you through an example of this because I think it's really big. Because when I'm doing this, I don't start with the story. Before I even look at the block, I think about what is the number one problem I'm having in my life? What do I need help with? What do I need advice on? And then I read the story, and I look through the story for what is relevant to me. So, for example, let's do David and Goliath again. If I am sitting in COVID, and I am simultaneously feeling isolated and numb and experiencing feelings of depression and isolation, and at the same time, I'm struggling to do things that I know I should be doing. I can't find motivation, even though I have lots of time and I'm feeling these emotions of shame and guilt and just all of these things are broiling over, and I'm just struggling to function that day. And I open up and I look at the story of David and Goliath. I start out and I look at that and I might say, these feelings that I'm having, this emotional chaos that I'm experiencing, that's my Goliath. And I'm David. And then I stop and think about how I'm feeling going up against my Goliath. And then all of a sudden, David isn't some random kid who did something 1,000 years ago, or more than 1,000, but you get my drift, something who did something ages ago. All of a sudden, you can understand some part of what he's feeling, because David was amazing. What David did was he went out, he was a shepherd boy, armed with no armor, he had a sling and a stone, and he walked up to a 10-foot-tall giant, clad head to toe in armor, wielding a spear, a proficient warrior who killed many, many Israelite warriors. And what he did is he walked up to him and he said, yeah, I can take him. And as I'm sitting here facing my metaphorical Goliath, all of these emotions that terrify me, all of a sudden the story of David and Goliath stops being a story about someone 1,000 years ago. And it starts being a lesson to me in my life right now on how I can act. Because David didn't know what was going to happen going in. He didn't know he was going to win. He didn't know the end of the story from the start. He didn't know how it was going to play out. But he was able to face his fears. He was able to do what he needed to do to save not only himself, but his people. And then you start thinking, well, wait a minute. If I can pull myself out of this slump, if I can get past these emotions, who else can I help? Who else can I teach? And it just keeps going and going. And the more you look at yourself and the more you look at the story, the more you see and the more you find. And it is so much deeper than just taking a story out of the abstract and looking at it and saying, oh, this is about this, and this is about this. And don't get me wrong, that is a good thing to do. But Likening the Scriptures gives scripture study that extra power, that extra ability to influence us that we just don't get in other settings. And that's why I think it's really something else. Now, I don't know what denomination you are watching or if you are atheist or whatever. These are meant to be educational. You can be studying the church as a academic pursuit, but if you do study scripture, I would recommend this process, because even though we did develop it in our church and it is kind of our thing, I would recommend it to anyone who is trying to glean deeper meaning from any kind of story, really. Any kind of story that is about good principles and someone you admire, you can get more out of it using this method. But yeah, these have been my thoughts and descriptions of Likening the Scriptures. This one, like all of my, very much like my perspective essays, these are based in actual established things that are taught in the church. Those will be linked in the description, but I have incorporated a great deal of my own experience and my own understanding of the concept. So just so that you're aware, this is not an official representation. I always say this, but I just want to make sure that it's clear, because I am flawed and there is nobody checking me on these. And I would hate to say something that misrepresents the church and then have someone take that as doctrine and hold it against the church, because this is me. This is what I'm doing. And I'm rambling on now. Thank you so much for tuning in and watching. I hope this has been helpful or at least interesting, and I hope to see you again next week.